Heavenly Father, we thank you for bringing us together this evening. We give you glory, we give you honor. We invite you to be the head of this gathering. Father God, we commit everybody in this gathering into your care. Even those who are on their way coming, we ask that you quicken their steps and give them a safe passage to be here. Father God, we commit the main speaker into your hands. We pray that, Father Lord, you will help her to deliver exactly as you've prepared her to do. Father, as she deliver, we pray that you grant us hearing ears to understand and work with all that she's going to address us with. This we ask in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Thank you very much, Justice. My name is Raymond Kujau Defed. I'm the General Secretary for the Accra Mining Network. The President is at the moment not in the country, so I will be holding forth till she comes back. We are expecting the Vice President to be here, but he's also out of town somewhere in the northern region. For those who do not know the Accra Mining Network, I can see we have a few new faces here. In a nutshell, the Accra Mining Network is an amorphous group of professionals in the mining industry. So because of the diversity we have, we are able to congregate and find solutions to trending problems instantly. We've had a few success stories, but then I would limit it to that of this year. This year, we have collaborated with the Center for Environmental Impact Analysis to develop and produce a handbook for the small-scale miner in Ghana. It was sponsored by the French Embassy. As I speak, we are also working with a US NGO called Pure Earth to do a similar thing, which is to have something to do with policy. It's still in the pipeline, so I'm unable to talk much on that. I'd like to use this opportunity to welcome everybody. We normally have a quarterly event like this, where we come with a resource person giving us a different perspective, a professional perspective on a particular subject. Today, we have assessing local content opportunities in the oil and gas sector in Ghana. At the right time, we'll introduce our resource person. We also have a bulletin that we're supposed to display today. We have a few printed, but it's not here at the moment, so at the right time we'll showcase that one too. It's a collection of all the works we've done throughout the past 12 months, so from March 2017 to March 2018. I would like to also use the opportunity to thank the Chamber. I saw the CEO right now. They have welcomed us here always to come and have this dialogue session here. This time, no, you should sit here. Yeah, so we'd like to thank the Chamber too for the opportunity to have this program here. The CEO has been encouraging us to grow and be part of the Chamber. So he does his very best in diverse ways to let us save that money to be part of it. Before we would start proper, I would just like to have a brief introduction. We always have our programs in an informal way. So we just want to have a brief introduction of a few people, members who are here. I would exclude the speaker and then the CEO. After that, he would have the opportunity to address us. So we'll come from you first. Just mention your name. Where are you from?
You pick the stamp. Traditional
Okay. Thank you all very much. At this juncture, I know the CEO of the Chamber of Mines is just coming out from another meeting, and he's made time to be with us. So I would hand over to him to just give us a brief encouragement or supporting words from him. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. When I heard AMA, I'm asking the question: is it the AMA we all know? Is it the AMA which is in charge of the AMN? Okay, so I was getting it wrong. AMN. So you're actually, silent on the last, letter. Anyway, thank you very much for coming. I'm quite excited to be here. I made it a point to be here by all means because the subject at hand is quite important to me as a person and to the Ghana Chamber of Mines as well. We are talking about local content in the oil and gas industry, and the oil and gas industry is also extractive as the mining industry is. So there will be, I hope, commonalities, opportunities for us to learn and share. But local content is common sense, isn't it? That is what it should be, especially when you have strategic sectors within the economy. It's important that as a people and as players within the space and policy, optimally linked to these sectors, because yes, we know that the extractives tend to be quite capital intensive, knowledge intensive, skills intensive, and all of that. But if we let it go as is the refrain, then trust me, we will not be harnessing the benefits of the extractive sector optimally within the country. And therefore, it's important that we actually all pull together to ensure that this happens. It shouldn't be rhetoric. It shouldn't be the usual talk. It's about dirtying our hands and implementing and making sure that it happens. So I'm here to lend my support because I think that it makes business sense. Business sense in the sense that that is the way it should be. You shouldn't be nudged by legislation to do local content. Local content makes business sense. If skills are available locally, they tend to be cheaper for the business. And therefore, it's important that even if they are not available, as strategic sectors, we bend over backwards to assist, to cultivate, to nurture, and to spawn, to ensure that we get them in the right quantities and the right qualities to actually fit into these strategic sectors of the economy. And therefore, with these few words, I really want to welcome you. I'm sorry, this place appears to be quite tight in terms of the sitting arrangement, but hopefully in the near future, when we welcome you, we should be able to have some more elbow room so that we can have a little bit more comfort sitting around and to have these insightful discussions. I'm happy that my colleague has agreed to join me here, Laurentia. Laurentia handles local content together with my colleague Evelyn. But I'm hopeful that the deliberations would also enrich her as it would enrich me as well. I thank you very much for coming and for doing us the honors. We are hosting you, but for us it's an honor that you find time to be with us this evening. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, sir. This was very impromptu, and but I thank you for delivering. We were supposed to have Solidaridad do a presentation of some of the things they are doing at the moment. I've been unable to communicate with them for the past 24 hours. So we save time on that. We will spend that time judiciously and go straight to the main cause of the reason we are here. At this juncture, I will call on Ellen Corley, yes, to come and introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you, Madam.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. It looks like we are not happy. Good evening once again. I'm here to introduce to you the key resource person for the Q2 meeting of the AMN. She is a lawyer by profession, qualified to practice in both England and Ghana here. She has a wealth of experience as a consultant on regulatory issues in the oil and gas sector, with over 25 years experience in public law, antitrust law, economic regulation, local content, supply chain, consumer protection, policy development in various sectors within the United Kingdom, Europe, and Ghana here. She was a consultant, a local content at the Petroleum Commission, Ghana, and a member of a board of trustees of the Society for Petroleum Engineers. Prior to joining the Petroleum Commission, she was a senior legal counsel at the Ministry of Energy, Ghana. She has also worked in a number of senior positions in the regulatory and policy sectors in the United Kingdom, as an adjunct lecturer and as a lawyer in private practices. The lady I'm going to introduce to you pretty soon holds a PhD law from King's College, London, an LLM from University College, London, BL from Ghana School of Law, LLB from University of Ghana, Legon, and a postgraduate certificate in competition, regulation, and economics from University of Nottingham. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce to you this evening the key resource person, and with an applause, can we invite Dr. Juliette Twumasi-Anokye. You're welcome, Doctor. Thank you. Ellen.
Thank you so much, Ellen. I couldn't recognize myself. I wasn't sure all those things referred to me, but thank you for that wonderful introduction. And good evening, all. Good evening. Good. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first time I'm speaking here. And to whom do I owe this pleasure? I owe this pleasure to your president, Georgette. Georgette and I go way back. We are Hobsons, so we went to Holy Child together many, many, many years ago. And I just subsequently discovered that whilst I took the oil and gas route, she took the mining route. So we seem to have a lot in common. Unfortunately, today she can't be with us. But tell her that I said thank you when you see her. It's not often that I get the opportunity to talk to people from the mining sector. Oil and gas, as the CEO of the Chamber of Mines said, we're both from the extractive sector, but sometimes we behave like ships in the night that never meet. We sort of pass each other by, but we have quite a number of issues in common. But unfortunately, we don't put our heads together too often to learn from one another. The mining industry is much older than the oil and gas in Ghana, and a lot of the teething problems that the oil and gas sector had, I'm sure the mining sector also had those teething problems. And looking back with hindsight is a fantastic thing. It would have been great if sometimes we could have sat down and said, look, guys, what challenges did you face for over the 100 years that there's been mining in Ghana? But nevertheless, it's better late than never. So now we're trying to collaborate as much as possible. So it's a pleasure for me to be here. Even though I'm the resource person for this evening, I'm also hoping to learn a lot from mining, because from you guys on the mining side, because a lot of times when I speak and then people ask, oh, is that the same in the mining sector? And I go, well, I'm not too sure. So it's a sort of a symbiotic relationship. It's not just me here talking. I'm also hoping that I'm going to walk away with quite a lot from you, so that in future I can see where the linkages are and where the challenges are. I also want to say thank you for the CEO, to the CEO of the Chamber of Mines for being here. It's a great honor to have you here, sir. And to my very good friend, Mr. Jantua, who has just come in. And also to say thank you to all of you for coming. Friday evenings, not very easy. Most of you could be having your kebab somewhere. So thank you for coming to listen to me. And I just see Kujo walking in from the Petroleum Commission. So thank you. So, what is my topic? My topic this evening that I've been asked to address you on is accessing local content opportunities in the oil and gas sector in Ghana. So that is what I'm going to talk about. For me, local content is very interactive. So I'm resisting the temptation to say stop me and ask questions, because we might never finish. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do my presentation very quickly, about 20 minutes, because you will have a copy of the presentation afterwards. And then I will then open the floor for any questions. And then if you give me the permission, I can also ask you questions about how it pertains in the mining sector, so that we can all do a learning process. So if we can go back to my outline, please. Yes. So what am I going to talk about? First of all, I'm just going to give you an overview of Ghana's upstream sector, so that we just get the context right. We know what we're talking about. And then very briefly, what is local content? And this is local content in the oil and gas sector, because I know you have your own definition of local content, which is slightly different from what pertains in the oil and gas sector. Then after that, okay, I think you've lost me there. Wow, so that's the grand opening, the curtain. Okay, so after we've spoken about the definition of local content, then very quickly, how was it developed in Ghana? What is the journey? And I'm happy Mr. Jantua is here, so if I miss any out, I'm sure he'll fill me in as to the actual battles they fought many years ago. Then accessing the opportunities. So to access opportunities, we need to understand what the value chain is. Sorry, I beg your pardon. We need to understand what the Ghana landscape is looking like, and then registering your company with the Petroleum Commission to enable you to take advantage of the opportunities. So if we can just get started. Next slide, please. So if we can do a bit of the geology of Ghana, just an overview of how things look like. Ghana has 4 sedimentary basins. So the map you see there shows the sedimentary basins in Ghana. It's not coming out very clearly, so you can't see it very well. But when you get a copy, you can actually see the various basins as shown on the map. I think for Currently, my particular area of interest is this bit. This is the Voltairean Basin. I'm sure you've heard a lot of talk about the Voltairean Basin. That is Ghana's only onshore basin. And there's a lot of developmental sort of seismic sort of work that has been ongoing there. The GMPC has a Voltairean Basin project, and basically it is believed that there's deposits of oil in that area. At the moment, there hasn't been any discoveries yet. There's just pre-exploratory work that is being done in that area. So that is just to give you an overview of the geology. We have 4 basins, sedimentary basins in Ghana. Okay, if we move on to the next slide. Okay, so the next slide just gives you a history of oil and gas in Ghana. Oil and gas development in Ghana is about as old as the mining sector. But the difference is that the oil and gas sector didn't make any commercial discoveries. So even though there was a lot of work that was ongoing in the background, it really wasn't an industry in Ghana because there hadn't been a commercial discovery until 2007. So we go back as far as the late 19th century. This is 1896 when some wells were drilled in Ghana. So there was always the belief, the geologists told us that looking at the geology of Ghana, especially looking at the geology of Ghana and across the Atlantic to Brazil, you know that we're on different sides of the Atlantic. So obviously, geologically, it stands to reason that there is the belief that we had the resources. So as far back as the late 19th century, there was exploratory work that was done. So the various phases, you then move to 1909 to 1925, some work was done. I just want to quickly move on to, it doesn't actually show here, but in 1972 is a year of interest, and is a year of interest particularly to me because I come from Solpon. I come from that wonderful city along the coast called Solpon, and in 1972 there was a discovery in Solpon which was thought commercial. Of course, now we know that it really wasn't as commercial as one would have wanted. So Ghana had some sort of oil and gas industry from 1972 in Solpon, which of course, unfortunately, didn't really develop to anything much. So that was the exciting period in 1972. We move on to the 1980s. All this time, there is a belief, and of course, a lot of money is being spent. Minor discoveries were being made, nothing really commercial. But of course, those shows gave confidence to the fact that, yes, Ghana had oil. So it was only a matter of time and a matter of technology before we actually found the oil. So we then moved to 2007, which of course we all know what happened in 2007 when we made our first proper commercial discovery, which is now currently being operated as a Jubilee field. And since then, there's been over 70 wells that have been drilled since the Jubilee discovery in 2007. So that's just the trajectory of our oil and gas industry in Ghana. So as you can see, it's about as old as mining, but unfortunately, there was no discoveries, so we couldn't really say that we had an industry. Next slide, please. So this is how things look like offshore. So this is Ghana's offshore activity map. So the colors, the polygons that you can see there shows you the fields that have gone. A few bits have changed. This map dates from last year. I haven't seen the most recently updated one that shows well, Hess is still there, but now we know that the Hess block is being, the Hess block has been taken over by ACA, the ACA consortium. But this is how things look like outside. I don't have a pointer, but on my left, you can see the Jubilee field in the corner, and of course you can see Ivory Coast, so you can see where the ITLOS issue, our border with Ivory Coast, where the whole ITLOS issue was based. This is a better map, so of course you can see the sedimentary basins that I was talking about. So you can see the Tano, Cape 3 Points, the Western Basin. That is where most of our discoveries have been made so far. You can see the Solpon Basin and SOPCL at the top. Solpon, that is where the shallow water, that is where in 1972 I mentioned that the discovery was made. You can also see the Accra, Keta, the Eastern Basin, which is our boundary with Togo. At the moment, there hasn't been any discovery, a commercial discovery there, although a number of wells have been sunk in there. And I know ENI unfortunately sunk a dry hole there and lost a lot of money. So there's still work ongoing there. So this is how it looks like outside Ghana. These are the blocks that have been taken. The next map. The next map actually shows you the open area. So the previous one shows you the blocks that have gone. And this map actually shows you how much acreage Ghana still has left. So as you can see, in terms of oil and gas, there's a massive, massive, massive opportunity for Ghana, because it's only, I don't know, in terms of the maths, it's probably about only, 10% or so of our acreage that is gone. So there is still, opportunities available out there, of course, subject to the government's regime, which I understand they're trying to put in place on doing a tender for blocks that will come up. So that is just to give you an overview of the geology of Ghana and how things look like offshore. Next slide, please. So now we move to the reason why we are gathered here today. So what is local content? I've got about 2 slides that talks about generic local content. When we talk about local content, what do we mean? What is the aim of these policies? What are they supposed to be doing? So basically, the idea behind every single local content policy all over the world, wherever local content, in whatever sector you find it, whether it's in the automobile industry, whether you find it in mining, whether it's in oil and gas, whether it's in agriculture, wherever you find local content policies, the aim is to try to leverage the extractive value chain to generate sustained and inclusive growth through economic diversification and employment opportunities. I like the World Bank, what the World Bank says about that, the last bullet point. And the World Bank says that it depends on early engagement and collaboration among government, the extractive industry companies, and communities. So unfortunately, in Africa and a lot of developing countries, the local content debate is held in the context of, it's only for the extractive industry companies. It is something they come in and do to us. But as you can see from what the World Bank is saying, it's not something that someone comes and does to you in your country. It is a collaborative effort. It's local content is the government has a role to play, the companies that are coming in have a role to play, and the actual communities within which these extractive projects are based also have a role to play. And if these 3 parties, if this tripartite arrangement is working very well, then you get very effective local content. Next slide, please. So, but it's important to know that what counts as local content is country specific. And it's not just country specific, it is sector specific. So what the mining sector might be looking for in terms of local content might not necessarily be what the automobile industry, well, because Australia did local content in the automobile sector, might not necessarily be what they're looking for. And each country also is looking at different things. So you'd find that I've just put Nigeria because Nigeria is our neighbor, and of course Nigeria has more resources than us, and Nigeria has been producing oil since their first discovery was, I think, in the 1950s. So they are basically our big brothers and sisters in this, and they have emphasis on the quantum of composite value added. I mean, people ask me, what do all these fancy English words mean? I don't know. I don't know, because these are words that people have put together. And at the end of the day, what most senior local content practitioners will tell you is that forget about the English. We know local content when we see it. When we smell it, when we taste it, we know there's local content. There's no need to put all the fancy English there. So I ask the Nigerians, what is quantum of composite value? And most of them are floundering. Okay, so that's where, and then you have the Ghanaian definition. So for Ghana, we are very, very interested. Nigeria is very interested in value addition. So as you can see, so that's why it's highlighted, quantum of composite value added. So you can see that their focus is not too much on money that people are getting. Their focus is on what value has been added to the industry in the oil and gas sector where Nigeria is concerned. If you look at Ghana, we are very, very interested in things that can be measured in monetary terms. So it means Ghanaians want to know how much money Ghanaians have made, if you look at this definition, if you go by this definition. Because essentially, the metric for measurement of Ghanaian local content is in monetary terms. That is what the definition is saying. And Ghana also has another interesting dimension to our local content, which is local participation. Some other countries don't particularly focus on local participation, but for Ghana, ownership, and we're Africans. For Africans, ownership is very important to us. We want to be able to look at our oil and gas fields or our mining concessions and say, how many of them are owned by Ghanaians? So it's not just about money, it's also about ownership. So in Ghana, in the oil and gas sector, they talk about local participation. How many Ghanaians actually have equity in our oil and gas sector? Trinidad and Tobago, they also have something similar to us in terms of local content and local participation. And I must say that that is because the consultant who was advising Ghana on drafting the Ghana local content law was from Trinidad and Tobago. So there are similarities between what Trinidad has and then what we have. So you can see that they are not just talking about, if under local participation, they're not just talking about ownership. They are also interested in control and financing. Because you can own a company and not have any control. You know, you own it, but in terms of the actual management and running of it, somebody else does it. So for the Trinidadians, control and financing is very important to them. And then we then come to the World Bank. The World Bank is very interested in share of employment and also sales into a sector. So this slide is just to demonstrate to you that when someone says local content, the first question you need to do is to stop them and say, what do you mean? Because for every country and for every sector, when they talk about local content, they're talking about different things. Some people are just talking about employment. When they talk about local content, they're talking about how many Ghanaians have a job. You know, some people are talking about how many Ghanaian businesses are operating in the sector. Some people are interested in how many Ghanaians have an oil block. So it's very important that when local content is mentioned, the first question you ask is, what does the person actually mean? In the next slide, what you see is what I've put there is common threats in all definitions of local content. So around the whole world, I did some research and discovered that every policy on local content, regardless of the sector, will mention some of the, you know, the things on this list. So most local content policies will have something about in-country value creation. Some will talk about jobs. Some are interested in usage of goods and services. Some are interested in skills development, capacity building, international competitiveness. If you look at, in the oil and gas sector, if you look at a company like Petrobras, which is the Brazilian oil and gas company, started as a Brazil national oil company like GNPC. Statoil as well, the Norwegian one, which is now called Equinor. They all started as the local oil and gas companies and now have moved on into the international sector and are competing. So for some, the companies being able to compete internationally is also important. Linkages between oil and gas and other sectors, important to some countries. And of course, you know, the big elephant in the room, monitoring and reporting to ensure the delivery of goals. There's no need having nice policies if there's no monitoring and enforcement. Okay, so how has Ghana done it in the oil and gas sector? So that's what we're going to talk about next. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So just to give you a bit of a legal context as to, I call this the legal brothers and sisters that underpin our local content regime. First of all, we have PNDC Law 84, which is currently being repealed by the EMP Act. But I still have that there because all the petroleum agreements in Ghana that were signed before the new EMP Act came into effect in 2016, the law that governs those petroleum agreements are the PNDC Law 84. So legally, laws do not have retroactive effect. So you cannot take the new EMP law and then go to some of the older companies that signed PAs and say, look, these new provisions apply to you. So even though that law has been repealed, there are sections of it that are still relevant for purposes of those agreements that were signed before the new EMP Act came into effect in 2016. Then, of course, we have the law that established GNPC, that is still extant, that is still in existence, PNDC Law 64. And this was also enacted in 1983, and that set up GMPC and gave GMPC a number of roles, some of which have local content underpinnings. So that is why it's there. Then the Petroleum Commission was established in 2011 as a regulator for local content, so that is also important. Then you have this law, that is a local content law in the oil and gas sector. That is a local content and local participation regulations passed in 2013. And then, of course, the latest is the EMP Act 2016. In terms of local content provisions that are contractual, we have a model petroleum agreement. I don't know whether you have something similar in mining, where everyone who comes for a mining concession, there is a standard framework that they sign up to. But we do have that in the oil and gas sector. So the model petroleum agreement is the basic terms and conditions against which everybody negotiates. So there are basic terms in there, but some of the terms are negotiated. Some of them are no longer used because some of them have now walked into the EMP law. So there are certain elements that are no longer negotiated. They are set out in the EMP law now. You have the petroleum agreements that all the companies have. I believe now government is very transparent. So if you go on the website of ENI, Talo, all the rest of them, you'll find the petroleum agreements and you can have a look and see what's in them. And then, of course, the subcontracts for goods and services also have local content provisions. So what is the journey of local content? Where did we come from the oil and gas? So in 2007, there was the commercial discovery, the Jubilee discovery. And for those of you who remember, there was a debate around 2007 that Ghana has discovered oil. There is no legal framework that governs Ghana's oil, and the usual. As the dialogue goes, these companies are here to come and rape and pillage Ghana, and there's no law in place and all the rest of it. To a very large extent, sorry, beg your pardon. To a very large extent, that wasn't actually very true. Ghana had laws in place. They may have been rudimentary, basic, but it wasn't a case of buccaneering companies that came in and took away our resources. There were some laws in place. It wasn't as tight as it is now, but be that as it may, government looked at the laws that existed and decided that there wasn't sufficient stuff there where local content was concerned. So in 2010, there was a local content policy specific to the oil and gas sector. The first time in the history of Ghana where there has been a specific policy geared towards local content for the oil and gas sector, specifically spelling out what the government's intentions were where the oil and gas was concerned. And then in 2010, of course, Jubilee, in December 2010, Jubilee, we achieved first oil. So the oil started flowing in 2010. So the Jubilee project was it was a world-class, and it was also the most hurried project that has ever been achieved in the oil and gas sector, because I think the development took about 18 months or so to get it to first oil. So there were quite a few issues that came up as a result of the speed with which the whole project was developed. Then in 2011, a regulator was set up to promote local content, and that is the Petroleum Commission. So in 2011, we now have in Ghana a regulator who, in addition to a lot of other technical functions, mandated to promote local content. In 2013, we have the law now being passed after a lot of vociferous advocacy and fighting and kicking and pooling in Ghana between the industry, government, even the diplomats got involved in the fray. They basically said you can't have a local content law. So it wasn't very pleasant. But ultimately, Parliament pulled through, and the law was passed in 2013. And then it became effective. There was a bit of a transitional period. So it was passed in November 2013, and it became effective in February 2014. So as we sit here now, the law has been in effect for about 4 years, about 4.5 years, roughly, nearly. And then, so once the law became effective in 2014, the ENI project, which is the OCTP project, all the contracts were negotiated, and they were negotiated within the context of the local content law, because now there is a law in place. So, it gave government a stronger hand in terms of negotiating, especially service contracts. And then in 2016, we have 10. We had first oil in 2016, and then all the way to 2017 when we had first oil for the ENI project. Hopefully, in a few months, there will be an addition because we'll have first gas for the ENI project as well. So, what is local content in Ghana under the law, in the oil and gas sector? What do we mean by local content? So Ghanaians, we want local content to be the quantum percentage of locally produced materials, personnel. So just list it in your head. So locally produced materials, personnel, financing, goods, services rendered to the petroleum industry that can be measured in monetary terms. So it's a very big, holistic, basically everything that can be done to the petroleum industry that is rendered by Ghanaians and can be measured in monetary terms. You are looking at a local content definition. And then, like I said previously, what is local participation? The level of Ghanaian equity, which is in the oil and gas industry. And that is very important to Ghanaians. So this is just very briefly the local content regulation. I've just got about 5 pillars because I didn't want to go through the law bit by bit because it's Friday evening and you have better things to spend your Friday evenings with. So the 5 key areas that the law is interested in is patronage of Ghanaian goods and services. So very important for the oil and gas sector. Companies must patronize Ghanaian goods and services. Okay, there's an interest in the employment of Ghanaian professionals. So we need to be able to ensure that Ghanaians actually get jobs in the oil and gas industry. Facilitate technology and skills transfer. The reason why the two are separate, because some people might think, well, if people get jobs, then of course skills and technology transfer follow. No, not necessarily. You might end up with an industry where you have a lot of Ghanaians who have got jobs, but they are all laborers. So at the end of the day, there hasn't been any skills transfer. So it's very important that it's not just about jobs, it's about technology transfer and it's about skills. Because ultimately, what we're looking at is we're looking at some of the internationally complicated companies that are operating in Ghana. We are looking at a scenario where Ghanaians are also able to do some of the technologically advanced things that they're doing. So it's not just about jobs. And then local participation, which is the share of Ghanaian companies' equity participation, and then developing local capacities, that is building the capacities of our Ghanaian companies. So you have skills development for staff, and then you have capacity building for the companies. So very quickly, what are the highlights? Okay, the highlights is that since the law was passed, for all upstream oil and gas companies, local content must be a component of their activities. So you can't say that local content is too difficult. So please let me develop my field and 5 years later I'll come back and no, it's not allowed. You have to demonstrate to government, GMPC, Petroleum Commission, the ministry, that local content is a key component of all the activities that you're doing. And you must show how you are going to achieve the various local content targets that will be set for you. And then this is also very, very, very important because this is a key to ensuring Ghanaian participation. So in the LI basically states that at least 5% equity participation of an indigenous Ghanaian company other than GMPC in all petroleum agreements. So for the moment, any petroleum agreement that is signed in Ghana, an indigenous Ghanaian company must have at least 5% shares in that petroleum block. That 5% shares is non-transferable. So if they decide they don't have money to develop the field and they want to sell their stake and someone wants to farm in, the only other company that is allowed to farm in must be another indigenous Ghanaian company. So they can't sell out to the international market. And if you've been following the debate in the press, and recently I'm sure you all heard of Exxon. Exxon came to Ghana, and in the Exxon PA, they haven't found an indigenous partner yet. And because they haven't found an indigenous partner, their petroleum agreement hasn't been ratified. The government has given them some time to go and find a partner because of this 5%. You're not starting until you've actually got an indigenous partner you can work with. And then it goes to Parliament. Then the agreement is ratified. Then, of course, Exxon can now start. So it just shows you how serious government is with that. Then, so that is for EMP activities. For service providers, for companies that are providing services, the local content law states that any foreign service provider that comes to Ghana to provide goods and services must enter a joint venture with an indigenous Ghanaian company. And the indigenous Ghanaian company must have at least 10% equity participation. So currently, at the moment, I used to be at the Petroleum Commission. I left last year. And before I left, all the foreign companies that had registered previously to provide services, all of them, because of this law, had to go and find local partners and form joint ventures. So at the moment, if you're a foreign company and you come to Ghana and you want to provide goods and services in the oil and gas industry, you can't do it unless you form a JV. And I'll pause here for a second, because there was a lot of debate about why government is going for a JV, why are they not going for technical partners and all the rest, because there's so many other legal arrangements that you can have with other companies to enable them to work. But government's position was that it wasn't just about technical partnership. It was very important for Ghanaian companies to actually also learn how to run these businesses, because if you're not a partner in a relationship, it is very difficult for you to understand how these companies operate. It's not just about the money, it's about the head office knowledge. How do they do procurement, how do they do tendering, how do they actually do the work? So as a result of that, the vehicle that government chose at that time was a joint venture relationship, rather than what persisted before, which was just normal technical partnership. Someone, a Ghanaian company goes and gets a contract and then just goes and flips it to some company outside. They come and supply everything. The Ghanaian takes their cut, and that's the end of it. You can do that for the next 50 years. The Ghanaian company isn't going to learn anything. If it's a joint venture and you have your skin in the game, because you have your skin in the game, you will be forced to learn and see how best the industry works. And as I said, the real idea behind all this is to ensure that ultimately we Ghanaians will be at the helm of our own affairs when it comes to the oil and gas sector. So the highlights again, the various key provisions. So just a list of them. Regulation 4 is about JVs. There's local content, minimum local content standards that are in the LI. There's some targets at the back of the LI. Regulation 6, 11 to 16 deals with procurement. I'm sure you all know in Ghana that in Ghana procurement is like, you know what I mean. Procurement is a huge issue. So even though technically, strictly speaking, the Ghana's Procurement Act doesn't apply to oil and gas companies because they are not government entities, what the local content law does is that it's taking the spirit of Ghana's procurement law, so they can't do sole sourcing. So just as we've had all this talk that we've been hearing about the news and all the rest of it about people doing sole sourcing, the same thing applies to the oil and gas companies. Per the local content LI, they are not meant to do sole sourcing unless there is a justification. So they have to write to Petroleum Commission and seek a justification if they want to do sole sourcing. All their contracts above $100,000 must be routed through the Petroleum Commission so that the Commission will be able to scrutinize and ensure that the right thing has been done and due process has been followed. So the procurement bit is an area that is very. Most people pick the LI and just open straight to the procurement bit and say, So, and then we have bits to deal with insurance and reinsurance. Insurance is very important in the oil and gas sector. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of capacity in Ghana when it comes to insurance and reinsurance. Our insurance companies are not as heavily capitalized as some of the international ones. So there is the need to push and develop local content in the insurance sector, as well as the financial services and then the banks in Ghana, because a lot of the banks in Ghana basically are not getting a look in when it comes to the oil and gas sector. Most of the companies are struggling. They can't take the facilities from the local Ghanaian banks because the interest rates are astronomical. You're competing with companies that are benefiting from 5% dollar interest rates from outside, some of them even lower than that. And Ghanaian banks, because of the state of our economy, 30% interest rate, it's suicidal. So that is an area that I know the Petroleum Commission has been looking at for some time now to see how best they can encourage companies and also the banks to come to some sort of accommodation to work together. I don't know how far they've gone with that. And then just to show that Ghana is serious, our local content law has offenses and penalties, including imprisonment. So it's not just fine talk. When there is a breach of the local content regulations in Ghana, there are very, very stiff sanctions that go with it. So far, no one has been jailed yet, so I don't know. But so far, I'm not aware of anybody who's been jailed. But let's let you know that the sanctions are there nonetheless. So now the law came into effect, and then how did the regulatory bodies or the Petroleum Commission at that time ensure that the law was settled in Ghana, it was developed, and then people complied with it? So a number of things had to be done. So first of all, they had to start with increasing in-country spend, because that's very important. You remember the previous slide about the 5 underpinnings of the local content law. In-country spend, Ghanaian goods and services is very important. So how do you do that? A lot of the contracts in the oil and gas sector came as very massive bundles. You can have a subsea development and the contract running into several billions. So the first thing was to unbundle those contracts so that you have them in bite-sized chunks, and that also allows smaller Ghanaian companies to participate. For some of the contracts, it was just a matter of shortening the duration. You know, you can't give a 10-year contract to one company. So if you make it like 3 years, 4 years, 4 years, then after every 4 years there's a tender. By then somebody has also developed the capacity, and then they can also compete. And then certain goods and services was reserved for indigenous companies. I think that was one of the singularly most spectacular thing that the Petroleum Commission did, which was basically to come out with a list that said, for this list of goods and services, no foreign company is allowed to tender for them. I can tell you off the top of my head, freight forwarding, catering services, that sort of stuff, because there was a belief that these are services that Ghanaians can easily provide. So why do you have to bring foreign companies into Ghana to provide you with your catering services and, supply of nuts and bolts and that sort of stuff? So, and then the actual bid evaluation criteria, the commission had a look at it and see, look, previously a lot of bids were evaluated only on 2 terms, technical and commercial. So they look at the technical. If you pass the technical, the next thing is that we look at commercial. Okay, who is giving us value for money? Not necessarily the lowest, but whichever one is the best value for money, and then you went with it. So a third criteria was now introduced, which is local content. So when you are evaluating a bid, we don't just look at the technical. Of course, the technical is important. Commercial is important, but then who is offering the best local content? So depending on the bids, and there were certain bids that the local content requirement was higher than the commercial, because of course the idea behind it was that we want more local content in this particular area. So yes, it might cost a little bit more, but because we want to develop local content in this area, the person who should win is the one who should have more local content. And various mathematical weightings were developed and were applied to ensure that in certain instances there was more local content in those bids. Then you had the various human resource requirements. So the commission now started strictly enforcing succession planning and work permits. So I'm not sure the extent to which you have that in the mining sector, so I'm hoping that you also teach me about that. But in the oil and gas sector, every single work permit goes through the Petroleum Commission. People are not allowed to go to immigration and apply for work permit themselves. You have to go to the commission, and of course you have to make a case to the commission that I want to bring in such and such an engineer, and the commission will then determine, well, is this somebody that you really need to bring? Does Ghana have that skill? If Ghana doesn't have that skill, fine, you can bring the person in, but then you must have a succession plan to demonstrate to the commission that the number of years that is going to take for you to train Ghanaians to be able to succeed the expert who is working in that role. And as a result of that, there were a number of jobs that were definite no. I remember when the commission started, things like finance manager, and it was definitely no, because the argument of the commission was that there are a lot of MBA, I'm sure there are plenty in this room, MBA finance people, and senior accountants and all the rest of it. So what is the justification for someone wanting to bring in a finance manager to Ghana, or a procurement man? These were things that the commission in the early stages determined that there was capacity in Ghana. So the work permit regime was closely linked, and that has been very successful. Then there was also the regulatory oversight of the contracting strategy. So even before companies went to contract, the commission would have meetings with them which we used to call ways of working meetings. And the idea behind those meetings was to sit and see how best a particular tender would be run to ensure that the requisite local content requirements were achieved. Next slide, please. So the outcomes, I mentioned to you that, some of the things that were very, very helpful is when the Commission started reserving certain goods and services. So at the moment, this list, I think it's increased now because as new things come up. The vehicle leasing and rentals, these are all reserved for local companies. So when a tender comes up, and for instance, I'll pick waste management. When a tender comes up and there's a waste management tender, you can be assured that foreign companies will not be allowed to participate because that is reserved for indigenous Ghanaian companies. So even at the tender stage, the ITT will not be sent to the big foreign companies because it is reserved for local Ghanaian companies. If you look at vehicle leasing and rentals, no, foreign companies will not be allowed to participate because there's quite a number of companies in Ghana now that have the capacity to do that. Then you have the other list on the right, which basically tells you that, these are things that the exercise found that, with a little bit more support can be done in Ghana. So at the moment, those ones are not 100% reserved, but there are things that, eventually, gradually, they might also end up on the reserved list. But this is a list that keeps developing because Ghana keeps developing. If you look at where we've come from since 2007, when Ghana achieved first oil, there are a lot more things that Ghanaian companies now have the capacity to be able to do. So depending on the tender, the Commission would sit down and say, look, this part of the work, if you look at the ENI gas project, for instance, the offshore receiving facility, the onshore receiving facility, I beg your pardon, specific elements of the contract was reserved for Ghanaians. The Commission sat there and basically said, we think this work can be done by Ghanaian companies. And a certain proportion of the work was specifically set aside for the Ghanaian local content partner and also the, the little companies that were in Sanzule, some of the communities providing catering services, cleaning, gardening, and all the rest of it. These are all small contracts that, local Ghanaians can provide. And that is as opposed to, I remember a number of years ago when Ghana Gas was starting the Ghana Gas project. And they brought in a list for work permits. And then some of the staff that the Chinese wanted to bring from China included cooks and gardeners. And they wanted work permits for them, because they didn't believe that any Ghanaians could do it. And at that time, the Commission had to stand its ground and say, no, we are not going to do that. So it's come a very long way, the journey that Ghana has traveled in relation to that. But there are challenges, like everything, nothing is as rosy as it seems. And in this world, everything comes with challenges. So what are the challenges? Okay, the JVs, they are joint venture companies, but gradually we are beginning to discover that some of the joint venture companies have just become shell companies. Instead of the idea behind it was to get people involved in actual capacity building. But unfortunately, some of them have just become shell companies and they are just don't do anything. At the end of the year, they get some $10,000 and they are happy and they go and sit and blow their money and come back. And then also there's a lot of, there's suspected transfer pricing. I'll use the word suspected advisedly because I know no one has actually been physically caught, but it is suspected that, a lot of the JVs are not making any profits because the internal pricing that is charged to the operations in Ghana may not necessarily be as value for money as you would get on the open market. So there are suspicions there. So, those are challenges that is being faced. There's also labor unrest because, of course, we had that with MODEC, where a number of staff on the FPSO were striking because they looked at the salary disparity, and I think it's something which is also common in the mining sector. I know Suleiman, we've spoken about this in the past. It's very, very also common prevalent in the mining sector where expats get paid huge sums and the locals get paid piddling sums of money. And sometimes, sadly, what we also found in the oil and gas sector is that some of these have come about because of the fierce competition between Ghanaian service providers. In terms of crewing, for instance, there are not too many rigs in Ghana at the moment, and you have a company that is providing crewing service at a particular price. Then you have another Ghanaian company that goes and says, how much it is charging you? I'll just take half. So ultimately, who loses? We lose and they gain, because there's so many few rigs in country, and there's not a lot of so many workers out there, and they're looking for it. Some will take any amount of money, but of course, the moment they get there and they start comparing their pay with their expert colleagues, they don't know what the owner of their business has collected as a contract sum. All they know is that I'm doing the same work with an expert, and I am being paid this amount of money. The expert is being paid X amount of money, and it's not fair, and it causes labor unrest. So that is also an issue that has arisen. Okay. Then, so I've mentioned a few rigs in country because, as you saw from the map that I showed you, Ghana has huge acreage that has not been taken. So even though there is an oil industry, we are a long way. Sometimes people ask me, oh, Doc, when are we going to be like Nigeria? I say, please, we are nowhere near Nigeria. If you look at in terms of what is going on in Nigeria and what is going on here, we are nowhere near Nigeria. So there is activity going on, but there's not too much. So sometimes that also causes challenges. You have, I think it's over 600 companies or so that are registered with the Petroleum Commission, all of them looking for work, and it's not all of them who find work. So sometimes it can be quite frustrating, because people on the outside sit and, oil and gas, everyone wants to get involved. And then they go in and then discover that it's not as easy as they thought, and we're not talking about politicians. Please, everybody promise me we won't talk about political corruption today. But from the real business perspective, it is difficult, because it's a very technical industry. It's very knowledge intensive. It's very capital intensive, and a lot of times Ghanaian companies go in and they struggle. And they are not. So sometimes you get a lot of, local content now becomes very disheartening, because people say, well, there's a local content law. It means we should be getting the contracts. But the problem also is there are 600 companies and there's not too much work. So sometimes it can be difficult. It can be difficult, if I can be very realistic today. Okay. Then you also have a lot of importation. The law, if you remember the definition of local content, we're talking about value addition. But there isn't a lot of value addition going on, because people are taking the contracts and just importing things in. So if people are just importing things in, then it becomes, our local content whole thing also becomes a challenge. So that's something that we need to look at. There's a bit of an oligopolistic market developing, because, a few companies have, and these are Ghanaian companies, have the experience. So you tend to find that a lot of the technical contracts are going to a few companies, because they are the ones who have the experience. And there are lots of other companies that are not getting work. So because of that, there's a bit of an oligopolistic market going. And the last point is very important: money. Cash, we don't have money. So sometimes it becomes an issue, because really they're going to get a contract. They won't give you 100% mobilization to perform the contract. You need some money to start up front. And you can't get a facility from the banks. You don't have any resources. It becomes a challenge. Okay. Then also the other challenges, the local companies, is very difficult to meet international standards. The various certifications, I'm sure you know about that. We have that in mining as well. And then there is insufficient data on local capacities. I mean, the average Ghanaian company, you visit them and say, look, what can you do? They'll tell you we can do everything. But we know they can't do everything. So it becomes very difficult. Who do you put forward? Who really knows what? Because they won't give you, they tell you give me the contract. You give me, when you give me the contract, I will show you. But the industry doesn't work like that. It works on you being able to demonstrate what capacity you have. And then there's a lot of unstructured local companies. Ghanaians, we like, I'm the CEO, my mother-in-law is the chief finance officer, my wofase is the head of HR, my daughter's boyfriend is a procurement officer, basa. You can't win you can't operate in this industry with that structure. But we know as Ghanaians that is how we are. Your wofase is the head of finance. He's misbehaving, but you can't fire him, because if you fire him, your uncle will get annoyed with you. So he's there, and he's not performing. So, and it just doesn't work. So sometimes these are also challenges, and these are cultural. Sometimes, we don't understand how the industry works. People get contracts and say, "Oh, I'm going to a funeral. Please, this Saturday I'm busy. I have a funeral." Well, no, it doesn't work like that. But these are cultural things, problems that we have. And then we have small percentage of contracts awarded to Ghanaian companies. So as a result of all these things, the Ghanaian companies aren't getting too many contracts. But then how do we access? So this is just a walkthrough of, a brief overview of the local content law in Ghana, in the oil and gas sector, how the law came about, the various provisions of it, what is good about it, and also what the challenges are, which are real. I'm sure in mining you also have your own challenges, which no doubt you tell me about. But for purposes of today, you wanted me to talk about how to access opportunities in the oil and gas sector, because of course there are challenges, but there are opportunities. Challenges and opportunities always go hand in hand. So how do you access the actual opportunities? What I am not going to do today is to actually put up a list of the contracts that are available, that Tullow has this contract, ENI, because that is information which is confidential to the companies. But what you can do is that all the companies will provide you that information when you approach them. So when you go to Tullow and you want their procurement list, they will show you their procurement list. It's just as government bodies also have their procurement list. They will show you what it is that they are going to procure for that year, and then you can decide what you want to do. So I'm just going to walk you through what you need to understand if you want to orient your mind towards taking advantage of the opportunities in the oil and gas sector. So I'm going to talk about 5 things: the value chain, levels of investment, what the supply chain looks like, what Ghana looks like at the moment, and then registering with the Petroleum Commission. Those are the key things that you need to understand to be able to take advantage of the opportunities. So next slide, please. So first of all, I think this is interesting because oil and gas is an extractive industry, so you find that the value chain closely mirrors what you also have in mining. So you have exploration, you have your appraisal, development, and production, and then perhaps decommissioning, which I haven't put there because Ghana has never really done any decommissioning yet. So we are not there yet. So this is a typical levels of investment that are required in Ghana, assuming that you wanted to go into the exploration phase, which is, the various seismic vessel, seismic acquisition, and all the rest of it. So just to give you a rough idea, these levels of investment are from, I think, the 10 projects. So it gives you a rough idea of what is required. So you have roughly about 200 million if you're looking at seismic, if you're looking at appraisal, if you're looking at development, which is usually the most expensive part of every oil and gas project, the production phase, and of course finally if you want to decommission. The only field which I know government is thinking of decommissioning is the Sulphur field, because it's more or less destroyed at the moment, but I don't know how far they've gone with it. I know there was talk of that being decommissioned. And also, you need to understand how the industry is structured so that you decide which part you think that, or which part is of interest to you, and that makes you determine whether you're going to find a partner to help you work in that sector or not. So what this slide does is to show you the various tiers in the upstream oil and gas sector. Who does what? So you have the big E&P companies. You have the integrated majors, companies like Exxon. Of course, they are massive. I think they're the biggest oil company in the world. So you have companies like them. You have large and small independents. So you have companies like Tullow. Tullow is an independent, and it's fairly, in the scheme of things, Tullow is fairly small compared to ENI and Shell and BP and all the rest. And then you have energy and utility companies that also operate in the sector. You have companies that are non-operating. So in Ghana, you have Cosmos, for instance. Cosmos is is a Jubilee partner, but Cosmos is not the operator. Tullow is the operator, but Cosmos is a partner. And Anadarko is also a partner, but they're not operating. So they also, and then you have pure exploration companies. Then you come to the various supply chain categories. So these big, you have these big tier 1 contractors. For example, if in Ghana, I'm sure you've heard of companies such as Technip and the rest. These are big tier 1 contractors, and they do, they do a lot of engineering intensive, very technical work. So these are basically very big companies at the tier 1 of the supply chain level. So you have your exploratory companies who then contract out to your tier 1 companies that are very big companies, Expro, that sort of, those companies doing a lot of work. Then you come to your tier 2, who are contractors and consultants. There's a lot of development work. Also, a lot of them are engineering companies doing engineering work. And then I'm not really too interested in the top because, for Ghana, we are still struggling to get there because of the monies involved and the technology involved to get to the top. So you find that most Ghanaian companies in the oil and gas sector, the indigenous companies, are operating around the last level, somewhere around here and there. So you have, subcontractors and sub-suppliers. So that's where you have a lot of the Ghanaian companies operating. And that's obviously, if you remember the previous slide that I spoke about, because of challenges with finance, because of challenges with certification, because of challenges with capacity, a lot of Ghanaian indigenous companies are not able to operate at the higher levels. The Ghanaian companies that are now being able to operate at the higher levels have been able to get there because of the JVs. So you have a lot of JV, well, of course, all the companies there now are joint ventures because the law doesn't allow pure foreign companies to operate. So you have Ghanaian companies that have formed joint ventures operating at the top level. But if you were to strip them out of the joint venture and ask them to stand on their own, they really haven't built the capacity for them to be able to work on their own. For instance, we have Maersk, their rig is in Ghana, their local partner is Rigwell, doing a lot of work. But if you strip out the relationship, Maersk is the one that has the rig. Rigwell is providing the support services. So even though arguably they are operating at the top level, if you strip out Maersk and you leave Rigwell on its own, it won't be able to do the drilling that Maersk is doing because it doesn't have a rig. So that I just wanted to clarify that the independent indigenous companies are at the bottom. All the top companies, Ghanaian companies, are in joint ventures, but of course, because of capacity building, it is still a challenge for a lot of the Ghanaian companies. Next slide, please. So this is a slide from Talo, which I like very much. I like it very much because it just demonstrates the industry, and it tells you which areas are specialists and which areas are not specialists. And usually what this supply chain circle is used to do is used to show in countries where local content is now developing, it's just used to educate companies about the non-specialists. The oil and gas industry is a huge, massive, if you look at it as a big elephant. But then you look at this and then it tells you, okay, there are the legs, there's a tail, there's a tusk, there's the head. And, these are the places where you can focus because perhaps those areas you don't need as much specialist knowledge as possible. So the darker blue circle on the outside, when you get the slide, you see better. You see things like freight forwarding, you see unskilled and semi-skilled labor, telecoms, office supplies, catering, fuel supply. These are all things that at the moment in Ghana, all these services are reserved for indigenous Ghanaian companies. And the reason why they are reserved is that these services are not really specialist services. If you are providing catering services to the mining sector, you should be able to provide catering to the upstream oil and gas sector because it's a similar sort of setup that you need to be able to do that. If you're providing freight forwarding, most freight forwarders are generic. They do freight forwarding for, if you buy a car from Holland, they ship it for you. In the same vein, if Talo wants to bring equipment from wherever they are bringing it, a freight forwarding company in Ghana should be able to do that. So these are all non-specialist services, which at the moment, as you sit here, if you have the capacity and you have any partners, you can go into that. And these services are all reserved for indigenous Ghanaian companies. There's no requirement for JVs in the dark blue circle. That's not the JV area. This is indigenous Ghanaian companies. Then you come to the middle, which is a bit, specialist, but it's it's not as really specialist as the core, the very light blue. The very light blue is a really, really technical bit where you're looking at things like well services, you're looking at seismic services, which are, you need a seismic vessel, which can be quite expensive, and the financial outlay is something which is out of the reach of most indigenous Ghanaian companies. So you look at the light blue, which I know, if I pick spare parts, for instance, I know that a lot of mining companies, you supply spare parts to mining, and that is, it's not as difficult as being able to make the switch, because already that is something that you're doing in mining. It's just knowing what is required and being able to do the switch. There's some construction services, field construction services. These are all specialists, but there are a lot of Ghanaian companies that are gradually moving in. And for our FPSOs in Ghana at the moment, the operations and maintenance of our FPSOs is an area that is reserved for Ghanaian companies, because the idea is that you need Ghanaians to learn how to operate and maintain an FPSO, so that eventually you don't need to bring foreign companies to come in to, if MODEC manufactures the FPSO, fine, thank God, they bring it here, let them leave and go, we'll manage it ourselves. That is the idea behind, the policy idea behind that. So this cycle is a very, very important cycle, because it tells you the outer, and it's nothing new, because you find that, the oil and gas industry is like any industry. They need to drink water just like everybody else needs to drink water. They need warehousing just like everybody else needs warehousing. So those are not technical services. It is more, the moment you want to go into the technical one, that the issue of capacity building and finances and all the rest now become a challenge. Next slide, please. So what I've also added is a value creation matrix. So, and that sort of echoes the cycle that I showed you, the big cycle with the deep blue. And then you see there's a small typo, it's going to be GDP, not GPD, value add. And the light blue at the top tells you that in terms of, basically what this matrix is showing you is which services have the potential to add value, more value to the economy, or more employment. So you look at the various axes and then you are able to tell. So if you look at drilling, you can see drilling right at the top, and you can see that in terms of effort, drilling is a very heavy duty technical stuff. But in terms of employment, it's no big deal, and it's sort of midway. Most Ghanaian companies you find are around here, this blue bit. That is where you find majority of the Ghanaian companies operating. And that is because that darker blue bit, the effort, investment, and time is lower. So the entry barrier is lower than the services in the light blue. Steel fabrication is, Ghana, we don't have steel. So you want to do steel fabrication, you have to import the steel. So that in itself can be a challenge for a lot of Ghanaian companies. So you find that in terms of effort, investment, and time, that is very high. So a lot of indigenous Ghanaian companies may not necessarily go there, because they think, well, for now, we don't really have the money. Why don't we just start with transportation and logistics? Because that one, you can employ a lot of people, because in terms of the employment access, it's somewhere here. So you employ a lot of people. And in terms of effort and investment, it's very low, because Ghanaians have been doing freight forwarding and warehousing for a very long time. So it's very easy. A lot of the big freight forwarding companies in the oil and gas sector now were generic freight forwarding companies that have now become specialized. In fact, a lot of them are now not even doing too much general freight forwarding, because they've now become so specialized in the oil and gas sector, they switched. And then if you look at, machine tools and spare parts, that is an importation job. Nobody is manufacturing spare parts and machine tools in Ghana. So that is also something that a lot of companies were able to do the switch and say, okay, in terms of effort and investment, it's not too much. I can switch. But then the idea that Ghana really, where Ghana ultimately wants to go is Ghana ultimately wants to also go to the light blue, so that we can also say that, you go to Nigeria, some Nigerian companies are already there. And we are looking at them and thinking that one day we will also get there. So this is just a further elaboration on the supply chain, tallow supply chain cycle that I showed you. So what does our Ghana landscape look like? So these are the projects that are currently in Ghana at the moment. So we have Jubilee. So we have the Greater Jubilee project. And, well, let me add Jubilee as well. So you have Jubilee, which I'm sure you all know about. That's been ongoing first oil was 2010. We have the 10 project as well, which is basically the same Jubilee partners, but different sides of the block. Then you have ENI with the OCTV project. And this is this used to be the HES project. I'm sure you know about HES, but then that they actually farmed out to the Norwegian company called Accra. So Accra has now taken over the Deepwater Tunnel Cape 3 Points project, and they are hoping to submit a plan of development, I think perhaps later this year or early next year. I don't know, but it's roughly around this year. So this is just to give you an overview of the projects that are currently ongoing in Ghana. So that is the OCTP, and it just tells you what it is. It's an oil and non-associated gas development. First oil, I was mentioning first gas is sometime meant to be around now or July. I think they're doing their final tests. And then you have the 10 field, which a lot of it was not complete because of ITLOS, but fortunately we won the ITLOS case, so they've gone back and they are doing their completions and doing the other wells that are left. We have Jubilee, our old friend Jubilee. So these are fields that are currently in production at the moment. The next slide, please, shows you the ones that are about to be developed. We haven't finished yet. So this is Greater Jubilee. Greater Jubilee is the whole of Jubilee. Only a small part of Jubilee was developed. So the greater part of Jubilee is going to be developed. So that is also ongoing. And then you have the Deepwater Tunnel Cape 3 Points, the block that has been taken over by Accra Energy recently. So these are the projects that are ongoing. Then this is just a diagram to tell you about, all the opportunities and accessing, getting into the oil and gas sector. How do you do it? Well, the first thing to do is that any company that wants to participate has to register with the Petroleum Commission. So what I have there is a list of the requirements. This is pulled from the Petroleum Commission's website. So the things that the Petroleum Commission requires to enable them register. There is a fee to be paid, and the fee, the commission assesses, each company is assessed individually. And then the commission then tells you what fee you have to pay. There's a lower fee for indigenous companies, and then there's also a lower fee for companies that are now starting operations. The finance team in the Petroleum Commission does an assessment, and then they will then tell you what fee you have to pay. Once you send these documents and they finish assessing your application, the commission then will issue you a permit, and then you get on their list. And the idea behind being on the Petroleum Commission list is that when there is a tender, because you remember that I told you that all the tenders have to pass through the Petroleum Commission, anything that's above 100,000. So the idea is that the oil companies go to Petroleum Commission and say, this is our procurement plan. This is what we want to do this year. We want to go to procurement. We want to buy XYZ. Okay. The commission then looks at its database and say, okay, this XYZ that you are supplying, we have 20 companies that are registered with us that can provide that service. Then the commission forwards the list to the oil company. Then the oil company will then contact the company and do their due diligence. If there's an inspection, they'll come and do an inspection. If it's an interview, they will do an interview. If they want your financials, the usual procurement stuff. Then at the end of the day, whoever wins, the oil company has to write to Petroleum Commission again and seek permission to award the contract. So the commission will take a copy of the evaluation report. This is all in the LI. The commission will take a copy of the evaluation report and satisfy itself that, yes, indeed, this company has won fair and square, no legally there, as you rightly said, thank you. And then the contract is then awarded. So that is how the oil and gas sector works. Without registration with the Petroleum Commission, it is very, well, I wouldn't say it's difficult, it's impossible, because the oil companies now will not award a contract to a company that doesn't have a Petroleum Commission permit. Even before you start procurement, the first thing they will ask is that bring your Petroleum Commission permit, to see. And as a matter of interest, as a consultant, someone was offering me work, and it was very interesting. And this is a company that I had worked for, that I had advised when I was head of local content in the Petroleum Commission, and they wanted to offer me work. And they wrote to me offering me work, and they said, Doc, can we see your Petroleum Commission permit? So that was the first thing I did. I sent it and they said, no, doc, you are not exempted. You set the rules, bring your permit. So I had to show them a copy of my permit, and of course, I was able to proceed and then get the work to do for the company. So, that is how things work in the upstream sector. If you want to take advantage of the opportunities, you need to understand all the things that I've put, and then in terms of actual steps to take, you register with the commission. But then the advice I give to companies is that don't just register with the commission and go to sleep, because a lot of Ghanaian companies do that. They register with the commission and they fold their arms and they go to sleep, and then after 6 months they then start complaining, nobody has contacted me. And I remind them that there are 600 companies, so some people are aggressive. So for some, even before the list gets to the Petroleum Commission, they are doing their own networking. They are going to the oil companies. They are talking to them. What do you need? When is it coming? What do I have to do? That work is work that the Ghanaian companies have to take on board themselves and do, so that by the time they are ready to do the tender, they are also positioned and prepared to be able to take advantage of those opportunities. So that is what I wanted to share with you today. Please feel free to ask me any questions that you have, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Juliette Twumasi-Anokye. That was very insightful and a great eye-opener for some of us. The next thing we'll do is to have a discussion. This is where we actually throw in a few questions, and she's also ready to learn from the mining sector. So it's an intercourse, if you permit me to say that. Earlier on, I said the vice president was somewhere in the north and may come. I'm happy to announce that the vice president of the Accra Mining Network, in the person of Mr. Tokonu, is here. Also, Dr. Amposa Mensah, who is directly behind him, also join us. And Mr. Kwame Janto has already been introduced, but is also a latecomer. So the floor is now open. Yes, I'm also here. The floor is now open for any clarification, any input, any suggestions, whatever, for a brief period. Then we would have the closing remarks, and then we go out and have the networking proper. So it's over to you now. You've heard a lot. Okay. All right. Okay.
The question is, in terms of policy, I realize that in the country we have separate industry policies. Has there been a meeting between the various commissions, for instance, Minerals Commission, the GMPC, Ghana Geological Association, so that at least for instance, over the Botean Basin, so we just get to understand that it's not just oil in there, but there might be gold, there might be other minerals that are of interest, so that we try to prioritize the way that we want to mine or extract from that basin. That's a meetings on that such.
Can I take like 2 questions?
Appropriate. 3 at a time, yeah. So, Brenda.
I'm surprised to see recently that there was flaring gas, but I thought that there was a gas pipeline. I know that there's a tremendous need in the country for fuel of all sorts, but the gas is it's being flared. I was just wondering if that's And I can be heard in this little room. How that fits into the long-term picture, the long-term planning for the development of the industry. Is there another question?
Okay, yeah. And last one is, how do you see the impact of new energy on oil production?
New energy as in in Ghana? Separate industry policies, whether there's been time, to the best of my knowledge, local content, all the ministry of education. I know there's a lot of dialogue, there's a lot of talk about that in the news. There's a lot of talk about a holistic national local content policy. I know the Ministry of Trade is meant to be looking at something like that. But in terms of a dialogue between, let's say, mining and oil and gas, sitting down and saying, look, let's look at how best our policies cross over, I'm not aware of that discussion having been held yet. But I could be wrong because I'm not in government. So if something like that has been done, I haven't seen that the outcome of that discussion. But it's a very important point that you raise, because to really develop local content properly, you need to have a cross-sectoral approach to local content development. Because, for instance, I'll give you a typical example of something that happened about 2-3 years ago, which was very unfortunate. There was the usual Ghana dollar fluctuation problem. Okay, so the Bank of Ghana, as it then was, came out with certain measures relating to the use of forex in Ghana. There was a restriction on banks and, services being paid for in foreign exchange and all the rest of it. So that was one side. That was the Ministry of Finance's policy. But of course, that had a direct impact on the oil and gas industry, because it was an industry where, the small Ghanaian companies are all being paid. You pay them in CD. By the time they do the work, there's a 3-month lead before they actually get paid. So you pay them in CD. By the time they actually get the money from the oil companies, because of currency fluctuations and currency losses, they are already operating at a loss. So even though on one hand, there was a policy from one arm of government looking at, the forex flows, on the oil and gas sector, you had individual companies that had to go to Bank of Ghana pleading and begging for exemptions. Fortunately, that regime didn't last, and the whole thing was suspended, and we've now gone back to the old days. So you can see how one aspect of the economy affects another aspect of the economy. But unfortunately, the sort of holistic, wider picture that one would expect in terms of a national local content debate, I don't think we've had that yet. In the local content LI, there's a role for the National Development Planning Commission, and they are meant to, together with the Petroleum Commission, coordinate some of these policies. But unfortunately, government seems to be operating in silos when it comes to local content. With even in the oil and gas sector, the downstream side have their own local content policy. The power people are doing their own thing, and sometimes it's very difficult to sit everybody down and say, look, let's look at it holistically. Let's have one policy for the whole of Ghana, and then perhaps look at the various sectors, how they interrelate, and how we can ensure that it is all harmonized together. So very valid point, but at the moment I haven't seen any policy statement or policy document that seeks to look at local content from that national mainstreaming holistic perspective. And then the second question was on gas flaring. Unfortunately, that is not a question I can help you with, because I'm not aware of gas being flared in the north of Takoradi, and I unfortunately, there's no one here from Ghana Gas. They would be the best. Okay, Mr. Jantua can help.
In terms of gas flaring, when you're doing exploration, a certain percentage of gas will be Ghana has a no flaring policy, but there is a certain percentage. Sometimes when we had problems with the FPSO, couldn't take the gas in. You would have to probably re-inject back into back into the well
I see.
to help more production come out. But it's just a certain quantum of gas that can go down. So you have no option. You don't have anywhere to put the gas. But we have a no flaring policy design.
Is it onshore? Well, I was referring to offshore. So even in one of the photos in the presentation was of the flaring gas. And I thought perhaps it's because there's not a refinery here to liquefy the gas and to use the gas pipeline. I thought that might be it.
Well, there's a
The
problem.
lack of the ability to beneficiate internally in the country.
So let me give you a picture of how it works. The gas comes out. It goes into the FPSO. They strip it of some chemicals, and then you have lean gas, which then is piped to onshore into the truck. They do another rehashing of it. You get lean gas, and that is what now goes to the Water River Authority and all the other companies for electricity production. So there is a processor that takes the gas.
Are they liquefying?
No, not yet.
No, that was really what I was
Like,
looking
right,
for.
right, no.
Because I knew that there was a no flare policy, which is why I was surprised to see flaring.
They're building a regasification plant that we
Okay.
at the moment. Ghana's gas is meant specifically for electricity production.
Thank you so much. I think the last question was a general question of the impact of new energy, and you're thinking of renewables on oil and gas. I think in countries like Ghana, it will take a very long time before we actually see, that actually taking place. But having said that, I'm aware that internationally, if you go to the UK, for instance, there's a lot of trials of electric vehicles and all the rest of it. And it is believed that at some point, this new energy will definitely have an impact on fossil fuel. But I'm a bit, permit me to be a bit skeptical. Well, not 100% skeptical, in the sense that this debate has been there for a very long time. And it seems that the more we find ways of using renewable energy, the more we also begin to discover other ways in which oil can also be used. So at the moment, for me, it's a very finely balanced, I'm yet to be convinced of a world in which there will be no use for fossil fuel at all. That is not to say that renewable energy will not play a role. I see a future where you have an energy mix, where you still have your fossil fuels as well as you have your clean energy, as they so call it, and then there is a choice as to what gets used. But a world in which no fossil fuels at all, I don't know. I mean, that may happen, but at the moment I am yet to be convinced that we will get to that world in our lifetime. It might happen perhaps in another 100 years, I don't know. But certainly in my lifetime, I can't see that. I think we're a very long way away. And oil is very versatile. We always find things to do with it. And there was a time where it was believed that we were all going to hit peak oil. What happened? I don't know. So I think that's the way I see the debate on renewables. Thank you.
Update you on some of the things where renewables are concerned. At the present moment, there is a law by government that any renewable energy that is produced, either wind, either solar, either wave power, any renewable energy that is produced, the electricity companies, GridCo, ECG, NEDCO, VRA, should take that power first before they even think of green fossil fuel power. The key there is the tariff. So, government is trying to set the renewable tariff between
8 cents to 12 cents. Because when you look at the tariff of fossil fuel, it's higher. And we are saying if the tariff for renewables goes in line with fossil fuel, then there's no need having the performance. And so they are really pushing renewable energy. And as you see, we've got some small percentage of solar panels that are producing electricity. Very, very small. The government is pushing that renewable energy. As Dr. Juliette said, whether we'll reach there is another thing. But the government wants us to be able to do that. So that if for nothing at all, renewable energy can go into probably domestic. And those are the fossil fuels can be used for industry and companies. So it isn't something that is impossible. It's got to do with whether we can meet the tariff and whether Ghanaians themselves can be technically viable to be able to do it. Now, if you permit me, if we can go back to Dr. Juliette's map on the volcanic basin, I wanted to show something here, which shows a crossroads between the mining sector and the oil and gas sector. That one. My voice back? Yes. So we are speaking live? Okay.
This is the Voltaire Basin. We are lucky that at the present moment, the central region isn't part of the Voltaire Basin. Why do I say that? Because, and mining people here, correct me if I'm wrong, lithium, yes, has been discovered in the central region, commercial quantities. The question now is that this whole area is said to be covered in oil and gas. I have asked the question. I've asked GMPC, I've asked Petroleum Commission, I've asked VRA, I've asked the Ministry of Energy, who is mapping out this basin. So, if it so happens, and now they're seeing signs of the rocks in the Kintampo area, Bronhafu area, that there could be a possibility of oil there. And we know that Kintampo area and that Bronhafu area is the food basket of Ghana. If it so happens, and I was in the NDPC, and we did the 40-year National Development Plan. And in doing the 40-year National Development Plan, we looked at the mineral capabilities in Ghana. Quite a lot of minerals are on this eastern corridor, western corridor, yeah? And there are minerals in this side. If it so happens that we find oil in this region, and the oil is found on a bauxite mine, it's found on a manganese mine, which do we do first? Which do we do first? And I can bet Juliette doesn't want to talk politics, but I think I'm entitled to talk politics because I'm also a politician. I bet your bottom city that government to go for oil. Now, in order to drill oil onshore is totally different drilling oil offshore. If for nothing at all, offshore you need $1 billion. Onshore, you need anything from $30,000 to maybe $200,000. What do I mean by that? You need something called a pump jack or a donkey head, which is the term. You need pipelines and you need a reservoir. Now, the key for politicians is which brings money in fast. And because oil brings money in fast, they would rather do oil than do any other thing. And this is where the mining community should start talking with the oil community and pushing government to map out this basin. America is one of the largest producers of oil. They don't drill oil in all the areas that they know. And then you will find that gradually we will be heading for the Nigerian Delta situation. The challenge we have in this area too are the porous borders we have on our coast. Very porous borders. So when the trouble starts, it's going to be very, very easy for Ghanaians. And one thing Ghanaians are very good at is fronting. I don't know whether we are lazy or whether it's because we don't read, but the moment you hear trouble, they will go to the Delta and bring the Delta people in because of the porous borders. And I remember when I was vice chairman for PIAC, and we went to the Volta region to do inspections, and we happened to go to the border. What the immigration people were telling us, that we need to do something about our porous borders. Now, the onus isn't on government. The onus is on the mining sector. The onus is on the oil industry to get government to start acting very, very quickly. Now, I was looking at when Doc was talking about the areas reserved for Ghanaians in terms of local content. Look, we're looking for Ghanaians to be multimillionaires in the oil industry. We're not looking for them to do only those services that they know. So some of us are preaching that where this basin is concerned, leave it for only Ghanaians. Because you don't need $1 billion FPSO. You need a pump jack, which you can even buy a second-hand one for $30,000. And it's onshore. And what it will do, it would help also train our petroleum engineers. And you don't need much up here. The second thing some of us have been saying is that all the oil and gas that we find here should not be exported. All the oil and gas we find here should be taken to the refinery, the gas to Etwabo. So this would be highly local content. And for some of us, that's the only way we can pick us up. Because right now, when you go to Nigeria, a lot of the Nigerian companies who have taken over some of the decommissioned fields of the Chevrons and the Shells, they are doing 20,000 barrels a day. Some are doing 30,000, some are doing 60,000, and they become multimillionaires. And I believe that in the shallow waters of Ghana, which really are marginal fields, we should leave it for Ghanaians. One of the major challenges we have is the politics that lives within our institutions. And the fact that Ghanaians would always want a quick way around it to make money. The oil industry is not a quick money industry. It's a long-term industry that would make you money in the long term. The last thing I will say is that in order for us to be able, and I'm sure it works with the mining companies too, in order for us to be able to get the capacity, we need to have banks that can finance these projects. There has to be a way where we can make sure that our banks have the capital, because without that capital, forget local content. No matter how little you are in there, you're doing your freight forwarding and all that, you just have a handful of companies doing, but you don't want a handful of companies, because what has happened in the Gulf of Guinea is that a lot of countries in the Gulf of Guinea have found oil and gas. And so the oil and gas trade, you would not only have to do oil and gas in Ghana, you can go to Sierra Leone, you can go to Liberia, even onshore, Chad, all those areas have discovered oil and gas. So there is a huge challenge which both the mining sector and the oil sector should start getting together to talk and see how best this place can be handled. Thank you.
Very quick response on the Voltaire Basin and the need for conversation between the oil sector and the mining sector. I know that there's been some conversation. I know the mining industry, not the private sector, but I'm talking about the public sector, Minerals Commission, Geological Survey Authority, and then the sector ministry. Some work has been done in the Voltaire Basin area, may not be that deep. And I remember a couple of weeks ago, we had a meeting in my office, and I had information that they've started conversations with the GMPC on the basic data that they have. So the good thing is that there's been some ongoing discussion. I'm not too sure about the depth of the discussions, but at least I have that information because they actually share that information with me, which is a good thing for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We would have our Vice President give us his opinion too.
Thank you. Doc, my question is, you mentioned that a small percentage of local content. How small in terms of quantifying it? And then the last one, just to add to what Mr. Jantua said, that has to do with our incorporating our land planning into our policies. Currently, so far as I know, where Atuabo plant is built on one of the best silica, which we can use for our glass industry. But that is where we have Atuabo situated. So it means that that resource is gone for good. So in the same way, if Kintampo is our food basket, we need to put it in our policy planning that this area is reserved for agriculture, nothing else. If that is what we want, we do that. So we need to have putting our land planning into our policy making. Thank you.
Thank you so much. In terms of, I'm not sure the context in which I said small local content, so I'm struggling to remember what the question.
So small in terms of the local content in the upstream.
The proportion, the contracts awarded to indigenous companies. Okay, and you wanted to know. Okay, I think the question probably should go to Kojo, who comes from the Petroleum Commission, but in terms of percentages. But I will tell you, I didn't bring the figures to this seminar because I didn't think that it was relevant, because we're talking about you accessing opportunities. But E&I has its own figures. Talo also has its own figures of local content that has been achieved in Ghana. Unfortunately, they are not in percentages. They are in contract sums. I think Kojo, E&I is about, what is it, 2 billion or what is it? Roughly, something like that in the E&I project. But I have a problem. I have a problem with those figures. I have a problem with those figures because those figures are a rough, those contracts that E&I, number one, E&I hasn't actually, in terms of putting out those figures, it hasn't actually given us local content at the granular level, in the sense that you've got a holistic figure, and you said 2 billion has been awarded to indigenous companies. Okay, my question is, are they really indigenous companies or joint ventures? Because those contracts, the best of my knowledge, went to companies that were JVs. Okay, if those companies were JVs, then logically the question you'll be asking yourself is, what is the Ghanaian participation in the JV? So if there is there's a JV for which a Ghanaian indigenous company has 10%, and that JV wins a contract of 500 million. Okay, for me to work out the real local content, my question would be, what is the role of the Ghanaian company in the performance of the contract? And how much of the contract did the Ghanaian company actually perform? And then on the back of that, you can actually extrapolate and say,
it is 5% or it is 2%. But it's a bit of a smoke screen if you come and you say they are joint ventures and we gave them 2 billion worth of contracts, when in actual fact on the ground we know that most of the goods and services these companies use for the performance of those contracts were imported. When we also know that a large contingent of the technical staff who executed the contract were expats, were not necessarily Ghanaian workers. The Ghanaian workers may have had a role in it, but perhaps very, very minute. So, and this is an issue which I've always been, having a bit of a ding-dong with E&I whenever I meet them, as well as Talo. And I've been basically saying that, look, your figures are not correct. Your figures actually mask what is really going on. Because if you award a contract for a rig to a joint venture, a Ghanaian and a foreign company, and it's so much money, what I want to know in terms of local content is how much in that contract that Ghanaian company is performing. Then I can safely say that, well, the local content is XYZ. And I also have another concern. My second concern is, what are we actually measuring? Because if you look at the LI is talking about value addition, so many different things. So my question has been, so what are we measuring? If we say a percentage of the contract sum, are we measuring value addition? If it's value addition, then we probably will end up with zero. Because what value has been added? If somebody brings a vessel into Ghana and you give them a contract for $500,000 and they bring a vessel into Ghana, and your local content metric says you are measuring value addition, then I would challenge anyone who says the 500 million is local content, because that is not what your law says. You should be measuring value addition. So what we need to work out is, what do we really, and at the moment there's a bit of a confusion. When I started with my presentation, I said local content means so many things to different things. So when somebody says local content has been achieved, my first question to them always is, what do you mean? What are you actually measuring? If you just want to know how many contracts went to Ghanaian joint ventures, that's fine. If that is your metric, then you're correct. But if your metric is how many Ghanaians were employed, and you tell me that there was a $2 billion contract, then you haven't really measured local content, so you haven't answered my question. So I think that is why I had that point on the slide, that a small number of, because if you're looking at the real indigenous Ghanaian companies, they are still operating at the low-hanging fruits, as they say, as Mr. Jancho, the freight forwarding and the catering and all the rest of it. When it comes to real core technical services, they are joint ventures. But a lot of the indigenous Ghanaian companies that are partners in the joint ventures are not getting a look in. So on paper, there's a JV. On paper, they have 25%. On paper, they have 30%. On paper, they have 10%. But in the real execution of the contract, when you go to the field and you want to check who is actually on the field doing the work, who is actually receiving the money, that is when you really begin to see that it's only very small number of companies that are, have benefited from the regime. So I hope that explains my point to you. Thank you. I think I'll reserve the OPEC question for my senior brother, Mr. Jantwa, because it has political undertones, and I did promise that I wasn't going to talk politics today. So I'll leave that for him. In terms of lobbyists, not in the American sense. I know in America, lobbyists, being a lobbyist is a full-time profession, and it is well respected, it is remunerated, and it is open, and I don't think we are not at that level in Ghana yet. So we don't have, we have our civil society groups. I wouldn't call them lobbyists, they're not lobbyists, but they're doing a very good job in the absence of the lobby that you have in America. That is not to say that people indirectly and perhaps clandestinely informally, don't try and lobby. They might do that, but it's not on the level that you have in America. So, Mr. Jantwa, are we going to OPEC or not? You are the politician. Tell us.
When we are drilling, out of our 3 blocks we have, we are drilling about 200,000 barrels a day. The 3 combined. And when Nigeria is drilling 2 million barrels a day.
But they weren't 30 years ago.
Well, they've even found more fields of gas than oil. And I would tell you that gas is much, much more profitable than oil because of some of the things gas can do. Equatorial Guinea has just joined OPEC. Why? Because of the quantum of oil and gas they produce. Now, with our minuscule 200,000 barrels, what voice would we have at OPEC? Hardly any voice. Hardly any voice. And this is the challenge we have with Ghana's oil industry. And from what I have seen, a lot of our oil is in ultra deep waters. Now, ultra deep waters, only a handful of companies can do ultra deep waters. ExxonMobil, who are one of those companies, are very interested in onshore. Why? Because the cost of onshore is not like doing ultra deep. And so if most of our oil is in ultra deep waters and you have onshore, how do we win? And ultra deep is a very dangerous area because your subsea equipment in there can even freeze sometimes. Pipes can break. So much challenges in ultra deep waters. And so if we can, and even when you come to the Keta Basin, when you look at the Tano Basin, it's gradual from shallow to deep to ultra deep. In the Keta Basin, it's very sharp, very, very sharp. And so we have a challenge in terms of the quantum of oil. That's why it is key that the revenue we are getting from our oil industry, we use it very, very well. Unfortunately, it's not so now. And so I believe that if we can in Africa, we should form our own OPEC, where we can also set prices for our oil. We can set prices for our gas. It's a question of leadership, whether the leaders of Africa are prepared to do that. Whether those in the OPEC region are prepared to invite us, we don't know. Time will tell. But when you look at the quantum of oil we are producing, I don't think we've reached the OPEC standard yet.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Juliette Twumasi-Anokye, for your presentation, the knowledge, time, and discussion. Mr. Jantwa, please, I understand you have something to do with closing remarks, but it appears you've made them together. But if you still have the time, then you should get ready. Okay. But before then, yeah, we've closed and we can actually continue there. But we'd like to thank you very much, and also the Chamber for offering this place for us, and also announce that our next quarterly meeting, which is Q3, will be in September, and we would have the full mail from Mr. Jantwa. So this is just a teaser, if I should let you know. We'd like to thank Justice and Dinah and John also for the background work to put everything together, and everybody that's here would like to thank you very much. Before I call on Mr. Chris Ankara to pray for us, after the prayers, we'll go out there and have small chops and then do the networking proper. I would like to announce that TV Africa is here. They will be picking a few people to do further interviews with, and also the Ghana News Agency is here. And also everything we've done is streamed on our Facebook platform. So thank you all very much. It's Accra Mining Network Facebook, yeah. But you would have to request to be joined. No, but the page is also there. The page you can easily follow and have access to it. Then you request to join this one too. So, yeah. Thank you very much. Now over to you, Mr. Prince Ankara.
Amen. Shall we bow down our heads for a word of prayer? Father, we thank you for a moment such as this. We thank you for the wisdom. We thank you for the know-how. We thank you for the knowledge. We thank you for the capacity. Grant us even this evening to be able to harness all this for that common objective, that we are going to be a better people, a better person, and a better country. We thank you and we bless you that even as we step out here, we will not cease, but then we will take up that absolute challenge to move forward, even as Ghanaians. And all of you say amen.